Why is it so difficult to talk about race? Small things like deciding to say African American or black can sometimes be tricky for white people. Back with us, City Journal contributing editor John McWhorter, Columbia University professor Mark Lamont Hill, conservative activist and columnist Star Parker, conservative radio talk show host David Webb, and libertarian activist John Mons. I'm going to be rattling off those names and titles in my sleep tonight. Should we talk more about race, less about race? Why is it so sensitive? And I'll tell you a story. The other day I was interviewing a friend of ours, D. Roy Murdoch, and I said to him, I used the phrase African American. He stopped me. I'm not African American, I'm black. Should I have known that? Was referring to him as African American offensive? Do the words mean different things when they come out of the mouth of a white person as opposed to a black person? Star.
Well, maybe to him. I don't know. You know, he is an individual who perhaps was offended by that. Maybe he's never been to Africa. But why do we talk about? Well, it could be. I don't know. But why we always talk about race is because race sells. Come on, we're never going to stop talking about race. Race is very, very beneficial to us as a society.
McWhorter, you're a linguist. Can you answer this question for me? Is there a difference between referring to a person as black and referring to a person as African American?
Yep, an African American person is somebody whose heritage is part African, meaningfully, i.e. a connection with the language of the dancing or the cooking, etc., and American, i.e. many immigrants that we know now who have accents, etc., or at least possibly somebody whose parents are African. But the idea that a descendant of African slaves, where the history goes hundreds of years back, is African American struck me as STOOPID 20 plus years ago.
Do I offend?
And I'm black too. I'm not African American.
Okay, do I offend people of color if I don't know whether to use the phrase African American or black, or do you not stumble over these issues?
I do make a distinction, but I'm not offended by either. I think John's distinction is partly connected to his own analysis, but in everyday usage, I think people make the
What is your analysis?
Black to me is a broader term. African American is about people who are the descendants of slaves, right? That's generally how it's used, and black is a wider diasporic use. So, for example, someone who's Jamaican would say, I'm not African American, but I am black. That's why your buddy said that he's not African American, because he's West Indian.
Do we not talk about race enough? Is there? I mean, you and I talk about this stuff all the time off air because we work together. But should we talk about these issues differently? Are you looking at me because my skin and thinking his skin is lighter than mine?
Unfortunately,
I think your hair's better than mine.
Unfortunately,
you mean I have more hair than you?
Yes, more and better.
Yeah, but hair is not politicized the way race is.
Unfortunately, what has happened, Judge, is that political correctness, because we tried to think of different terms, Negro, African American, all these things got inserted into it. Intellectually, John, we agree. I don't care whether you want to call me black, African American. There's only one race human. The problem is that we have to stop being so sensitive to what somebody says and then talk to them first.
John Mons, is it different in the South? Is the terminology used more sensibly or more intrusively? Does it matter if you refer to a person in the South as African American or refer to them as black?
You know, I think it depends on the person. I don't look at it as a homogeneous type of answer in which you say, well, you should use one or the other.
Right.
But it depends on maybe the situation. It can depend on the individuals involved. But the discussion should get away from race. We can always talk about race, and we have for a while. We need to get on talking about rights, and rights that respect all individuals, not because of your skin color, your race, or your gender. Rights are for everybody. That's why I think individual rights are the most important decision we could ever have today and going into the future.
Do you buy John McWhorter, Star Parker's argument that we talk about race because it sells?
I agree that it certainly does sell, but we also talk about it because there's a wound. We don't talk about it in a way that satisfies people, because there are many people who are waiting for an endless repetition of the idea that to be black is still all about racism. Most black people know that isn't true. Most white people do, and so we just stumble over the same misfire.
John McWhorter, Star Parker, David Webb, Professor Mark Lamont Hill, John Rounds, thank you very much for joining us in this conversation. Next, the plain truth on the state of equality and race in America. Does the government work for us, or do we exist to serve the government? Are the personal liberties that the Constitution guarantees truly guaranteed, or can any government take them away? Tonight, race and freedom on Martin Luther King Day. No serious discussion of race in America can be had without addressing slavery. When Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, He not only unleashed the most iconic phrase in American history, he articulated the central truth of the natural law, that our rights come from God and not from the government. Thus, the government cannot take them away without a fair trial at which it proves wrongdoing. Those words have resounded throughout history and have become a rallying cry for freedom-loving people, those enjoying freedom and those struggling against governments that have suppressed it all over the world. But how could a man who bought and sold and owned slaves be the articulator of such a definitive truth? 13 years later, when the Constitution was adopted, the framers declared that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. They, too, conveniently left out a definition of who is a person, thereby condemning blacks to another century of slavery and setting the stage for the bloodiest war in our history. Slavery is truly the most horrific crime in history. It presumes that, without proof of guilt, and in the case of American slavery, based on skin color alone, the government is possessed of the lawful power to take away free will and to subject humans to an existence like that of beasts. Had the founders adhered to their stated principles, had they been consistent in their rejection of a big government that failed to recognize their natural rights, had they understood that their oppression of blacks was far worse than the British King's oppression of them, they would have saved millions from the horrors of slavery and future generations from the twin evils of Jim Crow and segregation. Was the Civil War all about freeing slaves and bringing blacks into equality with whites? Or was it about whether states that voluntarily joined the Union could voluntarily leave it? Was Abraham Lincoln really a champion of civil rights and equality? Or did he just want to ship the slaves back to Africa after they were freed? If he believed in the equality of the races, why did he declare that he would make slavery legal forever if the Union would be preserved? If he was the so-called great emancipator, how could he have proposed an amendment to the Constitution that would have made slavery lawful and prohibited the federal government from interfering with it? Perhaps he, like the framers, was just a man who acted in his own political necessity, rather than accepting that the natural law recognizes the inherent rights of all human beings. The war between the states is one of the greatest tragedies in history, during which more Americans were lost than in all other wars combined, and during which we see for the first time on a large scale direct military attacks on civilians as part of official government policy. One could argue that it was worth it, because ultimately freedom for blacks was gained. One could also argue that it slaughtered innocents and unleashed governments that would soon take the liberty and the property of whites and blacks. In the generations following the Civil War, racist American presidents like Woodrow Wilson and his colleagues in state houses throughout the country would impose onerous taxes on people's incomes and would institutionalize racism. The federal government and many state governments would force white and black people to eat separately in public, to use separate schools, restrooms, park benches, sidewalks, lines at the post office, theaters, and trains, and to work in separate locations. This was the government telling people how to live, with whom to live, how to use their private property, and even taking their private property from them. In the infamous separate but equal U.S. Supreme Court case known as Plessy versus Ferguson, Plessy, a man who was 1/8 black, sued for the right to sit in the railroad car reserved for whites. It was not the railroad that resisted him, it was the government telling the railroad how to run its business. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that an unjust law is no law at all, he spoke truthfully of the natural law. He knew that the natural law was best articulated by St. Thomas Aquinas, who was white, and by St. Augustine, who was black. Dr. King was a champion of human freedom at a time in our history when it mattered most. His singular achievement was the removal of race from the government's decision-making. That alone continued the slow correction of the failures of the framers to be true to their words. On Martin Luther King Day, when we celebrate the birthday of a great defender of civil liberties, let's not restrict ourselves to the bits of history with which we agree, but rather subject ourselves to the full body of knowledge that we might know good from evil and protect ourselves from future slavery and future strife. After all, it is oppressive governments that historically have killed and enslaved. Martin Luther King Jr. set men and women free from oppressive governments. From New York, defending freedom every night of the week. So long, America.